Some people don't recognize value until the moment it's gone. The porcelain hit the marble floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the dining hall, a sound so precise it silenced every conversation within a 10-foot radius. And for a split second, even the string quartet seemed to miss a beat as heads turned toward the center table, where Ashley Whitmore stood with a faint, practiced smile, her manicured hand still hovering in the air from where she had casually let the gift box slip. And when she spoke, her voice carried just enough for everyone to hear. Cheap junk. 2 words, light, dismissive, almost playful, but heavy enough to land on Margaret Whitmore's chest like a weight that didn't belong there. And Margaret didn't move. Not immediately. She simply looked down at the broken porcelain scattered across the polished floor, white fragments catching the warm glow of the chandelier above like pieces of something that used to matter. And if you were watching closely, really watching, you might have noticed the way her fingers tightened. Just slightly around the edge of the table, not out of anger, not even embarrassment, but something quieter, something colder, like a decision being made in real time. Because what Ashley didn't see, what no one at that table understood, was that Margaret Whitmore had spent over 30 years building a life where nothing was ever accidental. Not the way she dressed, not the way she spoke, and certainly not the things she chose to give. And this dinner, this celebration in a private room, overlooking the city skyline, wasn't just another family gathering. It was a stage, even if only one person in the room realized it. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes flicking between his wife and his mother as if searching for the right reaction, but finding none that felt safe enough to commit to, while a few guests exchanged polite, uncertain smiles. The kind people wear when they sense something is off but don't yet know how serious it might become. And still Margaret said nothing. She didn't defend the gift, didn't correct Ashley, didn't even bend down to pick up the pieces. Instead, she lifted her gaze slowly, meeting Ashley's eyes with a calm that felt almost out of place. And when she finally spoke, her voice was soft, steady, impossible to read. "You're right," she said, just loud enough for the nearest guests to hear. And that should have been the end of it. A small, awkward moment brushed aside like so many others in rooms filled with wealth and polite tension. But then she added, almost as an afterthought, "You probably should have looked inside first." And for a brief second, Ashley's smile faltered, just enough to reveal the smallest crack beneath the surface, before she laughed it off, shaking her head as if dismissing the comment entirely. But Margaret had already turned her attention away, her eyes drifting back to the broken pieces on the floor, not with regret, not with sadness, but with the quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly what came next. And somewhere beyond the soft music and the low hum of conversation, a shift had already begun, subtle, invisible, but unstoppable, like a door that had just been opened and could no longer be closed. The music resumed, but it never quite found its rhythm again, like the room itself was listening for something it could not yet name. And Margaret remained seated with the same composed posture, her hands folded lightly in front of her as if nothing unusual had happened, while a server quietly stepped in to clear the broken porcelain, each piece lifted carefully as though it still held value. And Ashley leaned back in her chair, crossing one leg over the other, already moving on, already scanning the room for attention, because to her this was nothing more than a moment, a small correction in status, a reminder of who belonged at the top of the table. But Margaret's gaze followed the fragments as they disappeared onto a tray, and there was something almost precise in the way she watched them go, like she was tracking an investment rather than a loss. Daniel cleared his throat and reached for his glass, the faint clink of ice against crystal sounding louder than it should have. "Mom, you did not have to bring anything," he said, his voice careful, measured, the way people speak when they are trying to smooth over something they do not fully understand. And Margaret turned to him with a faint smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "I know," she replied, her tone gentle, almost reassuring. But there was a pause, a beat just long enough to settle into the space between them. "But I always do." And across the table Ashley let out a soft laugh, not cruel enough to be called out, but sharp enough to be remembered. "Well, maybe next time, something a little more modern," she said, gesturing vaguely as if the word itself explained everything. And a few guests chuckled politely, the kind of laughter that follows confidence rather than humor, and Margaret nodded once, as though accepting feedback at a business meeting. "Of course," she said, and then she reached into her handbag, not hurried, not dramatic, just deliberate, and pulled out her phone, the screen lighting her face for a brief second before she angled it away, her thumb moving with quiet efficiency. One message, sent without hesitation, no explanation, no second thought, and then the phone disappeared back into her bag as smoothly as it had appeared, and no one noticed, not really, because by then Ashley was already telling a story about a recent trip, her voice rising just enough to reclaim the center of attention, her words flowing easily, confidently, as if the room belonged to her. And for now, it did. But Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair, her gaze drifting past the table, past the guests, toward the floor-to-ceiling windows where the city lights stretched out in perfect, ordered lines. And if you had been sitting close enough, you might have heard her exhale, not in frustration, not in defeat, but in something closer to completion, like the first move in a sequence had just been placed exactly where it needed to be. And somewhere else in that same city, in an office still lit well past 9 in the evening, a phone buzzed on a polished desk, a message appearing on the screen with a single line that changed the direction of everything that followed. And back at the table, Ashley raised her glass, smiling as she toasted to new beginnings, completely unaware that the one she had just triggered did not belong to her at all. The city outside continued to glow in steady lines of light, but inside that room something quieter had begun to shift, not in volume, but in direction, and Margaret felt it the way experienced people feel pressure changes before a storm, subtle, precise, inevitable, while Ashley's voice carried across the table, bright and effortless, describing places measured in first-class cabins and five-star suites as if they were her natural habitat. And every laugh she received seemed to reinforce that belief, each nod from the guests confirming her place at the center of attention. But Margaret watched differently, not the words, not the gestures, but the patterns, the assumptions, the quiet confidence of someone who had never had to check what stood beneath her feet. And Daniel listened too, though his attention drifted, his fingers tapping once against the side of his glass before stopping as if he suddenly realized the sound was too loud. "You should host something like this more often," Ashley said, turning slightly toward him without fully looking. "Your family has the space, the name, it makes sense." And Daniel nodded automatically. "Maybe," he replied, but his eyes flicked toward his mother for just a fraction of a second, searching again for something he could not define. And Margaret gave him nothing, no signal, no resistance, just that same calm presence that had always made decisions feel smaller than they actually were. And across the table one of the guests leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to create intimacy. "Mrs. Whitmore, Daniel mentioned you used to be involved in some kind of investment work?" he asked, curiosity wrapped in politeness, and Ashley smiled before Margaret could answer. A quick, effortless interception. "Oh, it was a long time ago," she said lightly. "Back when things were different." The word hung there, vague but loaded, and a few guests nodded as if they understood something that had not actually been explained, and Margaret tilted her head slightly, considering the moment, the interruption, the narrative being shaped in real time. And then she spoke, her voice even, unhurried. "Yes, it was a long time ago," she agreed, and Ashley's smile widened just a little, satisfied. But Margaret continued, "But some things tend to last longer than people expect." And the sentence landed, quietly, without force, without emphasis, yet it lingered just long enough to create a small pocket of silence before conversation resumed around it. And somewhere else in the city, the phone that had buzzed minutes earlier was no longer on a desk. It was in motion, carried by someone who had already stood up, already made a call of their own, already begun setting pieces into place that could not be undone. Once they started moving, and back in the dining room, the server returned with fresh glasses, placing them carefully in front of each guest, the soft clink of glass on tablecloth marking time in a way no one noticed, and Margaret reached for hers, her reflection faintly visible in the surface, steady, composed, unchanged, while across from her Ashley leaned forward again, lowering her voice just enough to draw people closer. "You know, sometimes it is not about what something costs," she said, with a knowing smile. "It is about what it represents." And a few heads nodded, agreement offered easily, comfortably, but Margaret's fingers paused against the stem of her glass, just for a moment, as if acknowledging the irony, as if recognizing the precision of the statement without the awareness behind it. And when she finally lifted the glass, her eyes moved once more toward the window, toward the city, toward something already unfolding beyond that room, something Ashley had already touched without realizing, something that was no longer waiting for permission to begin. It happened so quietly that no one at the table realized the moment had already passed the point of return, because while Ashley continued speaking, her confidence steady, her tone polished, her world intact, somewhere beyond the glass walls of that private dining room, decisions were already being executed with a level of precision she had never had to imagine, and Margaret could feel it, not as excitement, not as satisfaction, but as alignment, the kind that comes when everything begins to move exactly as planned. And she set her glass down with a soft, controlled motion, the faint sound barely audible beneath the hum of conversation, yet it marked something, a line drawn without announcement. Daniel leaned slightly closer to her, his voice lower now, more personal. "Mom, are you sure you are okay?" he asked, and for the first time that evening there was something genuine in his tone, something unfiltered, and Margaret turned to him with a look that softened just enough to acknowledge the question without fully answering it. "I am exactly where I need to be," she said, and the words settled between them with a clarity that Daniel could not quite process, because they sounded simple, but they carried something heavier beneath the surface, something he had not been paying attention to until now. And across the table, Ashley's laughter rose again, bright, controlled, practiced, as she lifted her phone to show someone a photo, angling the screen just right to capture attention, to direct focus, to maintain control of the room. And for a moment it worked. The attention shifted back to her, the rhythm restored, the evening continuing as if nothing had changed. But then a subtle interruption broke through, not loud, not dramatic, just a presence at the edge of the room, a man in a tailored suit speaking quietly, with the event coordinator, his posture composed, his timing deliberate, and Margaret noticed immediately, her eyes moving toward him with a recognition that did not require confirmation, while no one else paid attention, not yet, because these kinds of moments never announce themselves. They simply arrive and wait to be understood. And the man nodded once, then stepped forward, his pace unhurried, each step measured as he approached the table, and the closer he came, the more the energy around the table began to shift, not because anyone knew why, but because something about him suggested purpose, and purpose changes rooms faster than volume ever could. Ashley's voice slowed slightly as she noticed the movement in her peripheral vision, her sentence trailing just enough to acknowledge the interruption without giving it full attention, and Daniel straightened in his seat, instinctively aware that this was no longer part of the planned evening, and the man stopped just beside Margaret, leaning down just enough to speak at a respectful volume. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his tone professional, precise, "everything is ready." And the words were simple, almost ordinary, but they carried a weight that did not belong to the room they were spoken in. And for the first time that night, Margaret allowed herself the smallest pause, not hesitation, not doubt, but confirmation, and she nodded once, a single, controlled motion that set everything else into motion. And when she looked up, again, her gaze moved across the table, settling briefly on Ashley, not with anger, not with judgment, but with something far more unsettling, a quiet certainty that the next moment would not belong to Ashley anymore. And Ashley felt it, just for a second, a flicker of something she could not name, before she dismissed it with a small smile, unaware that the evening she believed she was leading had already been rewritten without her. The shift was no longer subtle. It moved through the room like a change in temperature that no one could ignore once they felt it. And conversations began to slow, not because anyone had asked them to, but because attention was being pulled in a different direction, and Margaret rose from her seat with the same quiet control she had carried all evening. No rush, no hesitation, just a smooth, deliberate motion that drew more eyes than any raised voice ever could, and the man beside her stepped back half a pace, giving her space as if he understood that whatever came next belonged entirely to her. Daniel stood halfway as well, uncertain whether to follow or remain seated, caught between instinct and confusion, while Ashley stayed where she was, her posture still relaxed, her expression composed, but her eyes now fixed on Margaret with a sharper focus, the kind that comes when confidence begins to question itself. And Margaret turned slightly, not toward the entire room, not yet, but toward the small circle of guests at the table, her voice calm, measured. "I believe there has been a small misunderstanding this evening," she said, and the phrasing was gentle, almost polite, but it carried a precision that made people listen more closely than they intended to. A few guests shifted in their seats, glasses paused mid-air, and even the staff seemed to slow their movements as if the room itself was adjusting to a new center. And Ashley let out a soft laugh. Quick, controlled. "Oh, I think we are all fine," she replied, brushing it off with ease. But Margaret did not respond to the dismissal. She simply extended her hand slightly toward the man beside her, and he stepped forward, placing a slim folder onto the table with care, the kind of care reserved for things that matter more than they appear, and the sound it made against the tablecloth was almost nothing, yet it landed heavier than the shattered porcelain from earlier, and for a moment no one moved, no one reached for it, because something about the object itself suggested that opening it would change more than just the conversation. And Margaret's gaze shifted to Ashley, steady, unblinking, not confrontational, not aggressive, but undeniable. "You mentioned earlier that value is about what something represents," she said, her tone even, almost reflective, as if she were continuing a thought rather than starting a new one. And Ashley's smile returned automatically, though this time it was just a fraction tighter. "That is right," she said, her voice still confident, but now measured, aware that the room was no longer entirely hers, and Margaret inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement. "Then perhaps it is time we clarify what exactly was being represented," she said. And with that she placed her fingers lightly on the edge of the folder and turned it just enough so that it faced Ashley directly. An invitation, not a demand, but one that carried its own gravity, and Daniel's eyes dropped to the folder, then back to his mother, then to Ashley, the pieces not yet forming but no longer scattered, and across the table the guests leaned in, drawn by something they could not name, but could not ignore, and Ashley hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before reaching forward, her hand steady, her expression controlled, because hesitation was not something she allowed herself to show. And as her fingers touched the edge of the folder, the room seemed to hold its breath, not in anticipation of noise, but in recognition that whatever came next would not be undone by laughter or dismissal. And Margaret watched, silent, composed, already beyond the moment Ashley was just beginning to enter. The moment Ashley's fingers closed around the edge of the folder, something invisible shifted again, deeper this time, like a line being crossed that could not be stepped back over. And she opened it with the same controlled confidence she had carried all evening, her movements smooth, deliberate, practiced, because whatever this was, it had to fit into her world, into her understanding of how things worked, and for a second it did. Just paper, just print, just structured lines of text that looked familiar enough to dismiss. But then her eyes slowed, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else could immediately see, just a fraction, a subtle break in rhythm that only someone watching closely would notice. And Margaret watched, not the reaction, but the timing, because timing tells the truth before expressions ever do. And Ashley flipped the first page, then the second, her posture still upright, her face still composed. But the ease was no longer there, replaced by something quieter, something calculating, and Daniel leaned slightly closer, unable to stop himself now, his voice low. "Ashley, what is it?" he asked, but she did not answer right away, her eyes scanning again, slower this time, as if the words were rearranging themselves into something she had not expected to read. And the guests around the table felt it too, the silence stretching just enough to become noticeable, glasses resting untouched, conversations forgotten mid-sentence, because everyone understood that whatever was in that folder had changed the direction of the evening without needing to raise its voice. And Ashley finally looked up, her gaze moving to Margaret, not with the easy confidence from before, but with something sharper, more focused. "What is this?" she asked, and the question sounded simple, but it carried something underneath it, something closer to resistance than curiosity. And Margaret tilted her head slightly, her expression calm, almost patient. "It is what was inside the box," she replied, and a few guests exchanged glances, the connection forming too late, too slowly, and Ashley let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but did not quite reach that point. "This does not make any sense," she said, her voice steadier now, as if control could be restored by refusing to accept the premise, and Margaret nodded once, acknowledging the reaction without challenging it. "That is usually how it feels at first," she said, and Daniel reached for the folder then, unable to stay outside the moment any longer, his hand hovering for just a second before Ashley released it, not willingly, but because holding it any longer would have meant admitting something she was not ready to say out loud, and Daniel pulled it closer, his eyes moving quickly across the pages, faster than Ashley's had, because he was not searching for confirmation, he was searching for understanding, and his expression changed in stages, confusion first, then recognition, then something heavier that settled into his posture. Without permission, and he looked up at his mother, really looked this time, as if seeing a version of her that had always been there, but had never been fully understood. "Mom, this is," he started, but the sentence did not finish, because there were too many pieces connecting at once, and Margaret simply met his gaze, steady, composed, not offering explanation, not offering comfort, just presence. And across the table Ashley sat very still. The kind of stillness that is not calm but controlled, her mind moving faster than the room, recalculating, repositioning, trying to find the angle where this could still be turned, still be managed. But the problem was not the paper, it was what the paper represented. And for the first time that night, the balance of the room no longer leaned in her direction, it hovered somewhere else entirely, somewhere she had not accounted for, somewhere Margaret had been standing all along. Daniel's grip tightened slightly on the folder as his eyes moved back across the lines, slower now, more deliberate, as if reading it again might somehow change what it clearly stated, but it did not, and the weight of that realization settled into his shoulders in a way that could not be hidden, and when he finally looked up, his voice came out quieter than before, stripped of the casual confidence he usually carried. "You own this?" he asked, not to confirm the words on the page, but to confirm the person standing in front of him, and Margaret held his gaze without hesitation. "I always have," she said, her tone calm, factual, leaving no space for interpretation, and the simplicity of the answer did more than any explanation could have, because it removed the possibility that this was new, that this was recent, that this was anything other than a truth that had been present the entire time, unnoticed, unchallenged. And across the table Ashley's posture shifted just slightly, her shoulders straightening, her chin lifting a fraction higher, the kind of adjustment people make when they decide not to retreat, when they choose instead to stand their ground, even if the ground beneath them has already begun to move. "That does not change anything," she said, her voice steady, controlled, the words chosen carefully to maintain position, and for a moment the statement hung in the air, not fully accepted, not fully rejected, just existing, waiting to be tested, and Margaret nodded once, acknowledging the attempt. "You are right," she said, and the agreement came so easily, so smoothly, that it caught Ashley off guard for a fraction of a second, because agreement was not what she had expected. "It does not change anything that already exists," Margaret continued, her voice still even, still measured, "but it does determine what happens next," and that was where the shift completed, not loudly, not dramatically, but definitively, and the guests felt it, even if they could not yet explain it. The way conversation stopped entirely now, the way no one reached for their glass, the way attention locked onto the space between Margaret and Ashley, as if something invisible had drawn a line only one of them could cross, and Daniel looked down again at the pages, his mind catching up piece by piece. The structure, the ownership, the signatures, all leading to the same conclusion, one that reframed everything he thought he understood about his own position, his own life, and he exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in realization, and Ashley leaned forward slightly, her fingers resting on the edge of the table, her eyes fixed on Margaret with a focus that was no longer casual, no longer dismissive. "So what exactly are you saying?" she asked, and the question was sharper now, more direct, because control could only be maintained by forcing clarity. And Margaret met her gaze without any change in expression, without any need to raise her voice. "I am saying that you were correct earlier," she replied. "Value is not about the object itself. She paused just long enough for the words to settle. It is about what it represents, and then she let the silence fill the space after it, not rushing to explain, not softening the implication. Because the implication was the explanation, and Ashley felt it, not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, undeniable understanding that the moment she had dismissed something as insignificant, she had also dismissed something far larger than she had realized, something that had now been placed directly in front of her, impossible to ignore, impossible to reframe, and Margaret remained exactly where she was, composed, steady, already past the point of needing anything from the moment, because for her, the outcome had never been uncertain, it had only been a matter of timing. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was heavy, deliberate, the kind that settles over a room when everyone realizes they are witnessing something they were not meant to interrupt, and Ashley leaned back slowly, her fingers lifting from the table as if distance alone could restore control, but her eyes stayed locked on Margaret, searching, calculating, trying to locate the edge of this situation where she could still stand firmly. "You are making this sound bigger than it is," she said, her tone calm but tighter now, the smooth confidence from earlier replaced with precision, each word measured carefully, and Margaret did not react to the resistance. She simply watched, the same way she had watched the porcelain fall, the same way she had watched the room shift. "Am I?" she replied, not challenging, not defensive, just presenting the question as if the answer had already been decided somewhere beyond the table, and Ashley let out a small breath, almost a laugh, though it lacked the lightness from before. "It is paperwork," she said, tapping lightly on the folder as if reducing it to something manageable, something ordinary. "People sign papers every day." And a few guests shifted slightly, the statement familiar enough to sound reasonable, but the room did not fully follow her this time, because something in the tone did not match the weight of the moment, and Margaret inclined her head just slightly, acknowledging the logic without accepting the conclusion. "That is true," she said, her voice steady. "But not all signatures mean the same thing." And the words landed quietly, but they carried further than anything else that had been said, because they reframed the entire conversation without raising its volume. And Daniel closed the folder slowly, his movements more careful now, as if the object itself had gained weight in his hands, and he placed it back on the table. But not in front of Ashley this time, instead positioning it between them, neutral ground that did not belong to either side yet. And he looked at her, really looked, not as his wife in a familiar setting, but as someone standing inside a moment that neither of them had anticipated. "Ashley, this is not just paperwork," he said, his voice lower, more certain than before, and that was the first break, not in sound, but in alignment, because until that point, Ashley had not been alone in the room. But now the space around her shifted just enough to make that possibility real, and she felt it, the subtle withdrawal of certainty from the people around her, the slight distance in Daniel's tone, the quiet attention of the guest that was no longer supportive but observant, and she straightened again, her posture sharpening as if structure could replace what was slipping away. "So what do you want?" she asked, directing the question at Margaret now, direct, clear, because control, if it was to be regained, had to come through definition, and Margaret met her gaze without hesitation, without any visible change. "I do not want anything," she said, and that answer should have eased the tension, but instead it deepened it, because it removed the possibility of negotiation, of exchange, of resolution through simple means, and Ashley's expression tightened, just slightly. "Then why are we doing this?" she pressed, and Margaret allowed a small pause, just enough to let the question exist fully before answering. "Because you already did," she said, and the sentence was quiet, almost gentle, but it closed the distance between cause and consequence in a way that could not be undone, and for a moment no one spoke, no one moved, because the realization was no longer abstract. It was present, sitting at the table, impossible to dismiss, and Ashley's gaze dropped briefly to the folder, then back to Margaret, and in that brief movement something shifted again, not outwardly, not dramatically, but internally, the first true recognition that this was no longer a situation she could simply talk her way out of, and Margaret remained still, composed, already beyond the need for reaction, because the moment she had been waiting for had finally arrived, exactly as expected. The words settled into the room with a weight that no one could ignore, and for a moment even Ashley did not respond, not because she did not have something to say, but because she was measuring, recalibrating, searching for a version of this situation where she still held the advantage. And when she finally spoke, her voice was slower, more deliberate. "You are overcomplicating a small moment," she said, her tone controlled. But now there was effort behind it, the kind that did not exist earlier, and Margaret watched her with the same steady attention, not interrupting, not correcting, just allowing the statement to exist fully before it could be tested. And Ashley continued, leaning slightly forward, reclaiming space with posture if not with certainty. "It was a gift, nothing more, and I reacted honestly," she added, as if honesty alone could neutralize consequence, and a few guests shifted again. The logic familiar, the framing convenient, but the room did not fully accept it. This time because the context had changed, and context has a way of redefining what honesty looks like. And Margaret's expression did not change, but her eyes moved briefly to the folder, then back to Ashley, a small motion that redirected attention without force. "You are right," she said, her voice even. It was honest, and Ashley nodded slightly, seizing the agreement. But Margaret continued before the moment could settle. "And honesty reveals more than intention," she said, and that was where the distinction landed, quiet but precise, separating what Ashley meant from what she showed. And Daniel's gaze dropped again, his mind connecting the earlier moment with the present one, the dismissal, the words, the laughter, all now reframed through a lens he had not considered before. And he exhaled slowly, his hand resting near the folder but not touching it this time, as if proximity alone was enough to feel its presence. And Ashley's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, but in focus, because the conversation was no longer moving in directions she could predict. "So what exactly are you implying?" she asked, and the question was sharper now, less controlled, more direct, because control had begun to slip in small, measurable ways. And Margaret held her gaze without any change in posture, without any need to elevate her voice. "I am not implying anything," she said. "I am clarifying." And the difference between those two words was enough to shift the entire tone of the room. Because implication allows for interpretation, but clarification does not, and Ashley felt it, the narrowing of space around her, the reduction of options, the way the conversation was being guided without appearing to be controlled. And she straightened again, her shoulders aligning, her expression resetting into something more composed, more intentional. "Then clarify," she said, and the challenge was subtle, but it was there. An attempt to regain ground through directness, and Margaret allowed a brief pause, not for effect, but for precision, as if choosing the exact placement of the next piece mattered more than the speed of the move. And when she spoke again, her voice was just as calm as before, just as measured. "You did not recognize what was placed in front of you," she said. "And because of that, you decided its value." And she let the sentence settle, not expanding it, not softening it, because it did not require explanation. And Ashley's gaze dropped again, just for a moment, to the folder, to the pages she had already read. And this time the movement lingered a fraction longer than before, long enough for the shift to be seen, not by everyone, but by those paying attention. And when she looked back up, her expression had changed, not dramatically, not completely, but enough to mark the beginning of something new, something less certain, something more aware. And Margaret remained exactly where she was, composed, steady, no longer guiding the moment, because the moment was now guiding itself. The air in the room no longer felt neutral, it carried direction now. Like every breath taken inside, it had to pass through the same narrow space between what had been said and what could no longer be undone. And Ashley felt it more clearly than anyone else, not because she was weaker, but because she was the one standing closest to the shift. And for the first time that evening she did not speak immediately, her silence stretching just long enough to be noticed, just long enough to signal that something inside her calculation had changed. And when she finally moved, it was slower, more deliberate, her hand returning to the folder not with confidence, but with purpose, as if re-examining it might reveal a version of reality she could still control. And she opened it again, flipping through the pages with sharper focus, her eyes scanning for inconsistencies, for leverage, for anything that could restore balance. But the structure remained the same, clear, documented, complete, and Daniel watched her now instead of the papers, his attention fixed on her reaction, on the subtle shifts in posture and timing that told him more than the words ever could, and he saw it. The moment where certainty gave way to awareness, not fully, not completely, but enough to mark the beginning of change, and across the table the guests remained still, their attention no longer casual, no longer divided, because the situation had moved beyond social discomfort into something else entirely. Something that demanded observation rather than participation, and Ashley closed the folder again, this time more carefully, placing it back on the table with a controlled motion that carried more weight than before, and when she looked up, her expression had reset, composed, measured, but different, not as effortless as it had been at the beginning of the night, not as untouchable. "If this is about control," she said, her voice steady but quieter now, "then say it clearly." And the request was direct, stripped of decoration, because indirect language no longer served her, and Margaret met her gaze without hesitation, her posture unchanged, her presence steady. "It is not about control," she said, and the answer came without delay, without adjustment, as if it had never needed to be considered. "It is about consequence." And the words settled into the space between them with a clarity that made further explanation unnecessary, and Ashley's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the table, a small movement, almost invisible, but enough to reveal that the word had landed exactly where it needed to, and Daniel inhaled slowly, his understanding deepening in real time. The earlier moment, the dismissal, the words spoken without weight now returning with structure, with impact, with a context he could no longer ignore, and he looked at Ashley again, not with judgment, not yet, but with recognition, and that recognition created distance where there had been alignment before, and Ashley felt it, the subtle shift in position, the way the room no longer supported her narrative in the same way, and she straightened once more, but this time the adjustment was not about reclaiming dominance, it was about maintaining stability, and she held Margaret's gaze, no longer dismissive, no longer amused, but fully aware. "And what exactly does that mean for me?" she asked. And the question was quieter now, not weaker, but more precise, because precision was all that remained, and Margaret allowed a brief pause, not to create tension, but because the answer did not require urgency, and when she spoke, her voice was just as calm as it had been from the beginning. "It means that what you dismissed no longer belongs to you," she said, and the sentence closed the space completely, not with force, but with finality, and the room absorbed it in silence. The kind of silence that does not invite response, only understanding, and Ashley did not look away this time. But something in her expression shifted again, not dramatically, not outwardly, but internally, as the realization settled into place, and Margaret remained exactly where she was, composed, steady, no longer needing to guide the moment. Because the moment had already reached the point where it could not be redirected. The sentence did not echo. It did not need to. It simply settled into the room with a finality that no one could mistake. And for the first time that evening Ashley did not respond immediately, not because she had nothing to say, but because the structure she relied on no longer supported the kind of answer she was used to giving. And that pause, that small break in timing, was enough for everyone to feel the shift complete itself. And Daniel noticed it most clearly, the difference between the woman who had walked into the room and the one now sitting across from him. Still composed, still controlled, but no longer untouchable, and he exhaled slowly, his voice quieter when he spoke again. "Ashley, you need to understand what this means," he said, and there was no accusation in his tone, only clarity, the kind that comes too late to prevent what has already happened, and Ashley turned to him, her gaze steady, searching, as if looking for alignment that had always been there before, but now felt just slightly out of reach. "I understand perfectly," she replied, but the certainty in her voice no longer matched the certainty in the room, and Margaret watched without interruption, without satisfaction, simply present, because this part was not about proving anything. It was about allowing the truth to exist where it could no longer be ignored, and one of the guests shifted in their seat, clearing their throats softly as if to break the silence. but the sound only made the stillness more noticeable, and Ashley straightened again, her posture aligning with intention. "If you were trying to make a point, then you have made it," she said, her tone controlled, measured. "There is no reason to continue this." And the statement was firm, an attempt to close the moment on her own terms, to define its ending before it could expand further, and for a brief second it almost worked. The structure of the room leaning toward resolution, toward something that could be dismissed as uncomfortable but contained, but Margaret did not move, did not sit back down, did not allow the moment to be reduced, and instead she reached forward, not toward Ashley, but toward the empty space where the porcelain had once been, her fingers brushing lightly against the tablecloth as if acknowledging something that was no longer there. And then she looked up again, her gaze steady, her voice calm. "You are right," she said. "There is no reason to continue discussing it." And Ashley's expression shifted slightly, relief almost forming, but Margaret continued, her tone unchanged, "Because it has already been decided." And that was where the final line was drawn, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a clarity that removed all remaining ambiguity. And Daniel's eyes widened just slightly, the full implication settling in as the pieces aligned in a way that could not be undone, and Ashley felt it too. The closing of options, the narrowing of outcomes, the realization that this was not a conversation anymore. It was a result, and for the first time that evening her gaze dropped fully to the table, not to the folder, not to the guests, but to the space in front of her, as if measuring the distance between what had been and what remained. And when she looked back up, her expression had changed again, not dramatically, not visibly to everyone, but enough to mark the moment, enough to signal that the understanding had fully arrived, and Margaret remained exactly where she was, composed, steady, no longer needing to say anything further, because everything that mattered had already been placed where it needed to be. No one reached for their glass anymore, and even the soft music in the background felt distant, like it belonged to a different room, a different moment that had already passed, and Ashley sat perfectly still, her posture intact, her expression composed, but the effort behind it was no longer hidden. It was there in the way her fingers rested too precisely on the table, in the way her breathing slowed just enough to stay controlled. And for the first time that evening, she did not try to redirect the conversation, did not attempt to reframe what had happened, because there was nothing left to reshape, and Daniel watched her closely now, not as a partner sharing the same space, but as someone witnessing a truth unfold in real time, and that distance, quiet but undeniable, settled between them without a word being spoken, and Margaret allowed the silence to remain exactly as it was, not filling it, not softening it. Because silence, when placed correctly, does more than any explanation ever could, and one of the guests shifted again, this time more noticeably, their chair moving slightly against the floor as if they were preparing to leave, but unsure if the moment had officially ended, and that hesitation spread, subtle but present, because no one wanted to be the first to move, not when something this precise had just been completed, and Ashley finally exhaled, a controlled release of breath that signaled not defeat, but recognition, and when she spoke, her voice was quieter now, stripped of performance. "So that is it," she said, not asking, not challenging, simply stating what had already become clear, and Margaret inclined her head slightly, not as confirmation, but as acknowledgement, and the simplicity of that response carried more weight than any extended explanation could have, and Daniel lowered his gaze briefly, processing, recalculating, understanding that the structure he had taken for granted was never what he thought it was, and when he looked back up, his eyes moved from the folder to his mother, then to Ashley, and for the first time he did not try to bridge the space between them, because the space itself had meaning now, and Ashley noticed that too, the absence of alignment, the quiet shift in position that no longer favored her, and she straightened slightly, not to reclaim dominance, but to maintain dignity, because dignity was the only thing still entirely within her control, and Margaret watched that adjustment with the same steady attention, not with approval, not with criticism, just recognition, because she understood the difference between control and composure, and across the table the guests began to move again, slowly, carefully, glasses lifted, chairs adjusted, conversations restarting in low tones that avoided the center of the room entirely, as if everyone understood that what had just occurred was not meant to be discussed openly. And Margaret reached for her bag, her movements calm, unhurried, as though she were simply preparing to leave a dinner that had gone exactly as expected. And when she stood, the room shifted once more, not dramatically, but enough to mark the end of something that could not be resumed. And Ashley did not stop her, did not speak, because there was nothing left to say that would change the outcome. And Daniel remained seated for a moment longer, watching his mother with a new understanding, one that arrived too late to influence what had already been set in motion. And Margaret paused just briefly before turning away, her gaze moving across the table one final time, not lingering, not searching, just acknowledging the space as it now existed. And then she stepped away, leaving behind a room that no longer belonged to the same balance it had held only an hour before. The hallway outside the private dining room was quieter than the space she had just left, the soft carpet absorbing the sound of Margaret's steps as she walked with the same steady pace she had carried all evening, not faster, not slower, just precise, as if nothing behind her required a second glance. And the door closed gently without a sound, sealing the moment inside for those who remained, while ahead of her the corridor stretched in clean lines of light and reflection, uninterrupted, predictable, controlled. And for the first time that night, there was no audience, no observation, just movement. And Margaret allowed a single breath to leave her chest, not heavy, not relieved, just complete, because for her, this had never been about the room, the guests, or even the conversation. It had always been about recognition, about placing something in front of someone and allowing them to reveal exactly how they would treat it. And behind that closed door, Ashley still sat at the table, the folder resting in front of her, no longer just paper, no longer just words, but a boundary she had crossed without seeing it. And Daniel remained beside her, his silence now different, not uncertain, but aware, his gaze no longer searching for alignment, but understanding the distance that had formed in its absence. And Ashley looked down once more at the space where the porcelain had shattered earlier, the clean surface now restored, no trace of what had happened except the memory of it. And that was where the realization settled fully, not in the documents, not in the words spoken, but in that absence, in the space where something had been dismissed and could not be retrieved. And she straightened again, slower this time, her posture no longer performative, but intentional, as if rebuilding something from a position she had not expected to occupy. And the room around her resumed its quiet rhythm, conversations returning in careful tones, glasses lifting again, but nothing felt the same. Not to her, not to Daniel, not to anyone who had truly watched, because moments like that do not end when the person leaves. They stay, they settle, they redefine everything that comes after. And down the hallway, Margaret reached the elevator and pressed the button without hesitation, the soft chime marking its arrival as the doors opened smoothly in front of her. And as she stepped inside, she did not look back, not because she could not, but because she did not need to. And when the doors closed, the reflection of the hallway disappeared, replaced by her own image in the polished surface, steady, composed, unchanged. And the elevator began its quiet descent, carrying her away from a room where value had been mistaken for something small, where a single moment had revealed more than years of conversation ever could. And somewhere between floors, in that brief space where movement continues but everything feels suspended, the truth of it settled completely, not as a lesson spoken out loud, but as something understood without explanation, that some people lose what matters most not because it was taken from them, but because they never recognized it when it was placed directly in their hands.